Despite being a big Neil Diamond fan, I've never really gravitated towards the 1980s output, so that's made me go and rediscover the 1981 album from Neil's catalogue, which is On the Way to the Sky. Hello and welcome to Toby Jones Talks Music. I've done several videos about Neil Diamond in the past, and it's no secret that Neil Diamond is my favourite singer-songwriter. But as I said in the introduction, that period from Neil Diamond, the 1980s, is a period that doesn't really do it for me, or at least hasn't done up to now. Now this is going to be a little bit of a different review because it isn't one where I've gone and replayed On the Way to the Sky from 1981 and now I love it. But I did think that despite me not loving it and not having much of a change of opinion in this than before the video, I still thought it would be an interesting exercise, and there are a few topics which are certainly well worth talking about, and I have used my friendly 2 Neil Diamond reference guides now, which I always keep on the bookshelf, the biography by Laura Jackson and He's I Say by David Wells. Some really useful stuff in these books about the Neil Diamond catalogue, because it is a catalogue that when you look on the likes of Wikipedia at the On the Way to the Sky feed, it's not a great article, and around the web there isn't that much going on either. So these 2 books have been quite invaluable in me learning about what this album's all about and the context of Neil Diamond's career at the time. Well, it follows this, which is an album with some brilliant content on it. 1980's The Jazz Singer soundtrack, which I think actually saw Neil Diamond's peak for me in the 80s. I'm not talking about commercially, although it pretty much did. This went 5 times platinum. I think that On the Way to the Sky only went once or twice platinum, possibly. But for me, I think that this album and the tracks America, Love on the Rocks, Hello Again, and even Summer Love, which has become a recent favourite of mine, were never topped in the 80s. The one album that I am quite fond of is The Best Years of Our Lives. The other 4, though, released in this decade: On the Way to the Sky, Heartlight in 82, Primitive in 84 and Headed for the Future in 1986 are albums where, at least for Headed for the Future and Heartlight, and this album actually, there are one, if not a number of tracks that I quite enjoy, but as a whole album effort, it's not really there. And that is something that I think you can say is fairly agreed on among Neil Diamond fans from 1976 onwards. So we had the big album in Beautiful Noise, which I think possibly might be Neil Diamond's best album. I think it's pretty close between that and Just For You, which came out, I think, probably 10 years earlier, 66 or 67. And that almost feels like a compilation album with how good those tracks are on Just For You and how classic some of those songs have become. But I think Beautiful Noise, at least from the 70s, was the best album of that decade. And then things started to slide with I'm Glad You're Here With Me Tonight, You Don't Bring Me Flowers, and then this album from 1979, which I gave quite a scathing review when I did a review of it some years ago. Am I warm to it? Possibly. There's probably half a good album here, and some of it's not so great, but certainly what came after in 1980, The Jazz Singer, particularly those main tracks from the album, are absolutely stellar. So I decided to revisit On the Way to the Sky a couple of weeks ago around the Christmas period, and I just sat there in the dark. I don't normally do this. I don't normally dedicate all my time and attention, at least when I'm sitting at home, to listening to an album. I'll normally be doing something else in the background, then I'll go, oh, that sounds interesting, or that sounds good. And I just sat there and listened to this album, and immediately the first thing I thought is that this is just all too safe. It's too safe, it's too commercial, it sounds quite adult contemporary, and there's nothing really to particularly enjoy on this album. The album that has got 11 tracks on it, so the big single from this album was Yesterday's Songs, which starts the album, and then On the Way to the Sky, the title track, is the second track, and then on side 1 you've got Right By You, Only You, Save Me and Be Mine Tonight, and then on side 2 we have The Drifter, Fear of the Marketplace, Rainy Day Song, Guitar Heaven, and then Love Burns at the end of the album. We have to look at the inner sleeve to see that all of these songs are Neil Diamond originals. You can see side 1 and side 2 on here show that all the words were written by Neil Diamond pretty much, with some collaboration from his band members, apart from one song which is Love Burns, written by Tom Hensley and Alan Lindgren. But this is the first time for quite a while, discounting the soundtrack, that, well, certainly September Morn and those albums before that started to have a few covers on them. September Morn, the covers, it was quite covers laden, this actually. There was 1, 2, at least 4 covers on this one. Dancing in the Street and I'm a Believer were ill-advised covers, really. And then I did like The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore and Stagger Lee, but the likes of I'm Glad You're Here With Me Tonight, God Only Knows is okay, but there are certainly some covers in Neil Diamond's catalogue that certainly do start to raise an eyebrow. And even though this has got all original content, I just thought there's a reason why I didn't enjoy this in the first place, really. It's just all too safe. There's nothing that really grabs me. The one song that I have heard from this album a lot over the years is Yesterday's Songs. I very much came to this probably almost as a newcomer to this again, because it was one of those that I listened to probably once at the time and then never listened to again. That's an overall aim of mine in 2026, to try and listen to albums that I've already got, enjoy what I've got, but with that, most importantly, to play things that I might have only played once and then moved on from. There was a period some years ago that I was just buying vinyl and CD, whatever format it was on, buying a lot of stuff, and because I got so much to play, it was almost like I hadn't really got time to establish myself with an album. But I've learned from that now, so a lot of those albums that I did listen to maybe only once, I am going to try and rediscover this year. It might be like this one, that I don't love them all, but at least I can get a new opinion on this. So going back to what I was talking about before I went on that little tangent, that's the problem with normally. Sometimes I'll make a lot of notes before I go into videos like this, but I'm trying to do more things off the cuff and tell my own stories rather than kind of go, not off a script, but going off notes, which have got long sentences and long paragraphs. So back to that story anyway, that I was sat there and just thought, this is too safe. And side one, even when something sounds promising, like Only You, I thought, oh, okay, this starts interesting, and then it starts going a bit all over the place and a little bit too safe. And that was the problem. Side 2, I quite liked The Drifter when I heard it for the first time. That was interesting. And then the rest of it didn't really do much for me. Even in terms of the lyrics, we've got, so on side 1, we've got Save Me, which is quite generic. On the Way to the Sky is quite, bumbles along quite a bit. But then on side 2, you've got Rainy Day Song, where I'm like, what's all this about, really? And then Guitar Heaven, and it's very, very much generic and feels like an artist that has lost a lot of his creativity. The creativity that he had in the 70s is just completely zapped. But that was really unfortunate. But something did strike a chord with me about the first song, Yesterday's Songs. And it is a song that I've heard a lot. And of Neil Diamond's greatest hits, it's certainly not one of my favourites. It's okay, it's decent, but could I pass on it for others? Certainly. But what did really interest me with this song, and maybe has took on a little bit more meaning of this, and I didn't really, it's suggested in the lyrics, but in this book, He's I Say, from David Wilde, it talks about how he feels that the song feels somewhat defeated, very comfortable, a tuneful nostalgia trip, the middle of the road. And then the LA Times said that it was wallpaper music that's easily the least substantial single in Diamond's 15-year career so far. So pretty harsh, that one, but sharing a kind of mediocre opinion as me. I didn't want to say negative opinion because I don't dislike this track, but yeah, it's mediocre. I think that is fair to say. But what really interests me with this track is that he wrote this because he felt that none of his early songs would be remembered. Remember that this is only 15 years after the event. We're now almost 45... Well, we are this year, goodness. It's 2026, isn't it? We're 45 years after On the Way to the Sky. I'm sure we're not getting a 45th anniversary reissue of the album this year either. Of course, that concern that Neil Diamond had, I think, was calmed considerably when later in that decade, Red Red Wine was re-released by UB40 and Girl You'll Be a Woman Soon was re-released by Urge Overkill for the Pulp Fiction film. And now the big song that Neil Diamond's known for is Sweet Caroline. That's one thing that does, I don't want to say worries me, because for me, as long as you and I enjoy the music, that's great. But of course, for my passion for Neil Diamond, it would be great if he could get across to more people. And that does, I don't even think it concerns me necessarily, but I do think about it, that Neil Diamond might just be remembered for Sweet Caroline, and he's so much more than that. But what has given me a little bit of hope is, unfortunately, a few weeks ago as I record this, we lost Chris Rea, and his big song was Driving Home for Christmas. And I talked about this in the tribute I did to Chris Rea, that he did have a lot more songs than that, and most importantly, it was nice to see that in all the tributes I looked at on the likes of Facebook, that there was tributes to, I'm not going to go into all these other songs, but there were tributes to a lot of his other songs that he'd done, and it wasn't all about Driving Home for Christmas. And I hope that that's something that feels the same way for Neil Diamond. But I did think, yeah, that's quite interesting that music moves so quickly, and this is talked about in this book by Laura Jackson, the biography, that the landscape was changing a lot. You have to think about popular music, that Neil Diamond in the 60s, when he was first coming out, was in that popular music realm. That's how music sounded, at least from a popular standpoint in those times. But when we get to 1981, Neil Diamond's very much out of it in terms of a popular figure releasing albums. The chapter that this is talked about on The Way to the Sky, after all, is called Challenging Times in Laura Jackson's book, and I think that certainly is the case. But what you did see from Neil Diamond in the 80s, that although some of his catalogue wasn't as strong, at least in my opinion, his live performance pulling power only got stronger. And I think that was a massive part of Neil Diamond's career. So could it be that maybe the 80s stuff just wasn't as good just because he was focusing more on the live performances? It's difficult to know. But I did start to fall back into the old traps when I listened to this album. I think for the second or third time. I've listened to it quite a few times over the last couple of weeks to get myself fully ingrained in it. And one day I listened to this, then I moved on to Primitive from 84, then I moved on to Heartlight from 82. And I had to stop myself doing that straight away because I was going back into the old habits of listening to effectively what are 3 new albums for me. The material's that unfamiliar that I know a couple of the tracks, as I've said, from each of these albums, but to try and soak up all of that in one just wasn't going to happen. So I decided to go back to On the Way to the Sky, and what can I really say about it? The first song, as I say, Yesterday Songs, is okay. On the Way to the Sky is quite bumbling and doesn't really go anywhere, I don't think. Right By You, I don't like that one. That just doesn't do anything at all, really. Only You has some potential. Save Me is okay. Be Mine Tonight, I know that David Wilde really likes that one in this book. He says that it almost reminds him of a Lost Bang Records tune from the 60s. The Drifter does something a little bit interesting. Fear of the Marketplace on here is a track that talks about, well, as it said, the fear of the marketplace. It does change the beat to this album a little bit, the rhythm to this album a little bit. But then Rainy Day Song and Guitar Heaven don't really do a lot for me. But as I have to say, I've listened to it again this morning, and Love Burns, the last track of this album, does sound a little bit more like the old Neil Diamond from the 70s. It sounds a little bit more like that. To be honest, overall, I think after listening to this today, I don't think I'll revisit it all that much in the future. I don't think that however many times I listen to this, it's going to be an album that goes into my favourites bracket almost. It was an album that was self-produced by Neil Diamond, the first one that was self-produced by Neil Diamond as far as I can tell. So does that not have something to do with it? I'm not exactly sure. I think I'm going to try and revisit the rest of Neil Diamond's 1980s catalogue and possibly start with Heartlight and then go through. I wanted to strike while the iron's hot with this and talk about this because ultimately I'll kind of put it away and then not listen to it again. And it has been interesting to go through this On the Way to the Sky and revisit it. And that's something, as I said earlier in the video, is something I'm hoping to do a lot more in this year of 2026. Albums that maybe I've forgotten or only listened to once, to revisit them this year and maybe give them a little bit of a different light. And it hasn't worked maybe this time. And I don't think there's any of this that I go, oh yes, it will go into the best of Neil Diamond canon. But at least it's an experience that I know now. I haven't just listened to the album once and it's gone. I've kind of talked about it and understood it a little bit more for me, and hopefully it's been interesting for you as well. And I guess there are some people out there, I'm sure there's one person out there that On the Way to the Sky is their favourite Neil Diamond album, so please don't feel offended that I'm not so much of a fan about this album. I don't like to talk about music that I dislike, and there maybe are one or two of these tracks that I'm not fond of, but that doesn't mean I hate them. It just means that I won't choose to listen to them again. I think that's the important point, that I do like to talk about music I'm passionate about, because of course that's the most exciting and nourishing thing for me. But I felt I wanted to do this as a big Neil Diamond fan. I want to get round to talking about every album in his canon at some point to give a completist point of view. And this one, unfortunately, isn't the best, and I think that's something that possibly might well carry on throughout the decade. I can't say that for everything else. I do like The Best Years of Our Lives, but funnily enough, I revisited that some time ago, and that's not quite as good as I remember it being the first time I listened to it. I think, to be fair, with how good this is, or at least some of the tracks, maybe not the whole album as a whole, I think it's almost unfair to put that on a soundtrack as well, because ultimately they are songs from the film, so some of it's not going to be as strong, and there's some traditional tunes in here as well, so it's going to be flawed for that particular reason. But I think that very much the decade did peak with this, and it was a sign from the late 70s, I think, of a wider dip in Neil Diamond's fortunes. We saw this in 79, September Morn, and before that, the stuff isn't all that great. I think very much the first part of the 70s and the late 60s were where Neil Diamond peaked, probably. There are some things to enjoy from this decade, so if I was going to give a top couple of tracks to go and revisit on this album, I think there would be possibly the first track, even though it's not my favourite, but having that context and that meaning behind it now does something for the lyrics. I'd say Love Burns, the last one, and then the other track might be, I'd go either with The Drifter or probably Save Me, maybe, from this album, but I don't think it is one I'm going to revisit all that much in the future. One thing I will end on that got on my nerves, and I don't know why it did. If you look at the back cover there, right, with all the songs, look at the way that any Y's, the font is on the Y. So I thought that this was maybe someone had written on my cover when I looked at the first couple. So if you look at that Y at the end, at the top of it, there's almost like a dash at the top. And then on Right By You, there's the Y, there's a dash at the bottom. And what actually this made me realise is that you've got those two songs with Y, Right By You and Only You, and anything that had got a Y on in this album really started to annoy me because of the way the Ys were done. And it's exactly the same on the front cover as well. I mean, this is just a completely, absolutely petty thing for me to be pointing out. Look at this. On the Way to the Sky, and you've got the Ys that have got like a little flag at the top of them. Don't know why the font's set out like that. But if that's something that I can get mad about, then I need to get a grip, quite frankly. But I hope you've enjoyed that little review of On the Way to the Sky. I don't think it's going to be the same as reviews that I've done for albums that I have loved over the years and can wax lyrical about. It's not quite the same as that, because ultimately I don't have the same passion for this album, but I still thought it was a worthwhile exercise to do nevertheless. As we go into 2026, though, I have expanded the reach of this channel across social networks, so the channel is available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, so you can watch this or listen to this in podcast form, and any future videos that I've done, and I've done this for a little while now, so there is a bit of a archive starting to appear on there as well. But make sure to go and follow us on the likes of Facebook and Instagram if you have those platforms, because I do release a post saying that a video's come out, so if you don't necessarily see these in your YouTube feed, then those other social networks are a good idea to try and see the content ultimately. That it might not appear on your recommended feed. I appreciate people, like back in the day, don't necessarily use a subscription feed on YouTube anymore. That's just the way it goes, isn't it? Times change. But if you enjoyed this, leave a like down below. Please leave a comment down below. Not because I'm not preaching that, because likes and comments and subscriptions really help your video in the algorithm. No, what I want to do, one of my main passions with this project, the music project, is to talk to you. Ultimately, if you've got so far through this video, I would have thought that you possibly have an opinion somewhat on this album, On the Way to the Sky. And it's an album that on the internet there's not much coverage of, so if you've got an opinion on the album, I'd love to hear it down below. We can start some conversations, that would be great. And also, if you would and you feel it's worthy, then please do subscribe to the channel for all future music content. There's plenty of Neil Diamond content on the channel, as well as other artists and as well, and hopefully that sneaky YouTube algorithm can recommend something up there which will keep you watching the channel. But whatever you decide to do, have a good rest of your day.